Hello again. Anti-racism, as we now know it, has been around since the 1930s and was largely the creation of two Jews. Franz Boas was born in Prussia, which is now part of Germany, of course, in 1858. He may be seen in the thumbnail to this video. His parents were Jewish, although not religiously observant. He began his academic career studying physics and geography, but then became interested in anthropology, which was at that time a fairly new discipline. After embarking upon a field trip to study the waters of the Arctic, Boas instead became fascinated by the Inuit people of Canada. A few years later, still in his 20s, he emigrated to the United States, in which country he spent the rest of his life. He is today known by some as the father of American anthropology. Boas' thinking has been enormously influential in anthropology and the idea of racism. He was, for instance, the mentor of, among others, Margaret Mead, of whom some viewers have probably heard. In the early years of the 20th century, the traditional Victorian beliefs about scientific racism still held sway. It was thought that there was a strict hierarchy of both races and the cultures which they produced, with the Anglo-Saxons at the pinnacle of racial, intellectual, scientific, cultural and technological development. Franz Boas thought this a short-sighted and parochial perspective. He promoted instead the notion of cultural relativism, suggesting that there was no objective way of judging between different societies and cultures, and that all such opinions were subjective. Who was to say that the British, with their technologically advanced civilization, were actually a more worthy culture than that of the Aboriginal inhabitants of Australia? Such ideas may have been groundbreaking and revolutionary in the 1920s, but they are, of course, now the orthodox and accepted view of most educated people in the West. This led, almost as a matter of course, to the revolutionary thought that if this was the case with societies and cultures, could it also be true of the individuals who made up those populations? If the Inuit culture, or that of the Kalahari Bushmen, was in no way inferior to that of Britain or Germany, then why should we think that the men and women in those African or Canadian groups were somehow inferior intellectually or in any other way to, say, the British royal family? Perhaps cultural differences were all. Boas showed that the then popular idea about the world races being separate and distinct, with particular physical features associated with each of them, was largely mistaken. He demonstrated that studying skull size and proportions, to which great importance had been attached when studying the different races into which mankind was supposedly divided, was little better than the old pseudoscience of phrenology. As far as it went, Boas' work was perfectly correct, and the way in which he dismantled the ideas relating to race, which had been riding high for a century or more, was masterful. He worked with the black sociologist and historian W.E.B. Du Bois, and with him was involved with the National Association for Coloured People, which was founded in the United States in 1909. Boas worked too with the researcher and inventor Booker T. Washington, who was of course also black. There's no doubt at all that he was quite indifferent to the colour of a man's skin and the culture from which he came, an admirable enough sentiment and perhaps not a common one in America in the first half of the 20th century. Franz Boas was not the only person in the field of anthropology who was advancing the idea that the only differences between different ethnicities were cultural, and that culture alone could explain any supposed inferiority in intelligence. One of his students, Ruth Benedict, went on to enjoy a distinguished academic career herself, and was able to advocate for cultural relativism from within Columbia University. A 1934 book, Patterns of Culture, made her one of the most well-known anthropologists to hold such views. It is these two people who are the founders of anti-racism as we see it operating today, and their names are not perhaps as well known as they ought to be.